At 54, 3 days after she signed the divorce papers on a kitchen table that no longer felt like hers, Joanna Tillett sat in the parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly in Harlan County, Kentucky. With $340 in her checking account, a cardboard box of her own belongings in the back seat, and a voicemail from her daughter she hadn't been able to make herself play yet. The box held a coffee mug, 2 sweaters, a photograph of her mother, and a ceramic rooster she'd bought at a church sale in 1998 because it made her laugh. She had left behind 26 years of furniture, a garden she'd planted and replanted every spring, a house she knew the creaking language of in the dark. What she had not left behind, tucked into the pocket of her coat because she'd grabbed it off the dresser without thinking, was a small brass key on a piece of twine. She had never once in 26 years seen her ex-husband Lyle open anything with. She didn't know yet what the key was for. She didn't know yet that finding out would take apart everything she believed about the man she'd spent half her life resenting, and that by the time she understood it, she would not be able to put herself back together the same way. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. If stories like this one find you at the right moment, and something tells us this one will, take a second and subscribe to Grand Stories, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these reach. Now let us tell you about Joanna. Joanna Tillett had married Lyle Breck at 28 in a small ceremony at her mother's house. The kind of wedding where the flowers came from someone's garden, and the cake was made by a neighbor, and nobody minded. Lyle was 30 then, a quiet man who worked for the county road department, maintaining the 200-odd miles of secondary roads that most people used every day without thinking about who kept them passable. He wasn't a man who talked much. He fixed things. Pipes, fences, the transmission on her mother's Buick. He showed love in the language of tasks completed, and for the first several years Joanna had found it enough. The cooling came slowly. It always does. By her mid-40s she had begun to understand that what she had mistaken for steadiness in him was actually distance. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't wonder about her day or her worries or what she was reading, or what she thought about anything beyond the practical. She would try to start a conversation at dinner, and he would answer in 4 words and go back to his plate. And the silence that followed wasn't comfortable anymore. It was a wall. She started keeping a journal, which she had never done before. In it she wrote the things she would have said to him if he'd been the kind of man who listened. By the time she was 50, the journal had 3 volumes, and Lyle still didn't know she kept one. He was not unkind. She wants you to understand that. He never raised his voice, never left her short on anything she needed, never made her feel small with his words. What he did was simpler and harder to name. He was absent. Present in the house, absent in the marriage. She used to think about that distinction late at night when she couldn't sleep. A man can be in the room with you for 20 years and never really arrive. She asked for the divorce at 53. It was the hardest conversation she'd ever started and the easiest Lyle had ever seemed to finish. He hadn't argued. He'd sat very still at the kitchen table and looked at his hands and said, "All right, Joanna, if that's what you need. Not what you want, what you need." As if he'd been expecting it. As if he'd been waiting for her to say the word first. They had no children together. Her daughter, Brenna, was from a relationship before Lyle, and Lyle had raised her without complaint and without warmth, which was more or less how he did everything. Brenna was 30 now, living in Cincinnati, and she'd never quite forgiven her stepfather for the specific coldness of being raised adequately instead of lovingly. She'd been relieved when Joanna told her about the divorce. She'd said, "Mom, honestly, I'm glad." The settlement was clean because there was almost nothing to split. The house went on the market. Joanna took her car and the ceramic rooster and moved into her cousin's spare room in Harlan and tried not to think about what 54 with $340 in a parking lot was supposed to mean for the rest of her life. The key sat on her dresser at her cousin's house for 3 weeks before she picked it up again. It was small, brass, the kind of key that opened a padlock rather than a door. There was nothing written on the twine. She turned it over in her fingers for a long time sitting on the edge of the guest bed, and the only thing she was sure of was that she'd never seen Lyle put it down somewhere so she could find it. He'd always had it in a drawer or a jacket pocket. When she found it on the dresser the morning she was packing to leave, she'd assumed he'd left it accidentally. She'd meant to mail it back. Instead, she'd put it in her coat. She called her cousin in from the kitchen. "You know anything about Lyle keeping property? Land or a storage unit or something out of town?" Her cousin Vera, who was 61 and had lived in Harlan her whole life and knew most things worth knowing, tilted her head. Lyle Breck. Vera thought about it. I heard something once, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Somebody said he'd been driving out toward the Clover Fork area on weekends. But I figured it was fishing. Joanna had figured the same thing when she'd thought about it at all. Lyle left Saturday mornings around 7 and came back by late afternoon smelling like sawdust and machine oil, and she had been so worn out from the distance between them that she'd stopped asking where he went around year 3 of the disappearing, and he'd stopped volunteering it somewhere around the same time. He never brought home anything. Not fish, not stories, not whatever he'd been out there doing. She found the property through the county assessor's website on a Thursday afternoon, which is how you find things in eastern Kentucky when you don't have money for a lawyer. There it was, a half-acre parcel on a gravel road off Clover Fork, purchased 7 years ago for $600, assessed value of the building on it listed as negligible. Grantee, Lyle Allen Breck. She sat with that for a long time. 7 years ago she had still believed the marriage could be saved. 7 years ago she'd bought a book about communication in long-term relationships and left it on the coffee table hoping he'd pick it up. He never had. He'd been spending his Saturdays on a piece of land she didn't know existed. The next morning she drove out. The road to it was exactly the kind of road Lyle spent his working life keeping passable. 1 lane, gravel, steep in places, the kind of road that most people in the county could name but wouldn't bother with, unless they had a reason. She followed it 2 miles past a closed feed mill and a cattle gate, and came out on a flat above a creek bend, and there it was. It wasn't much. A low building, cinder block on the bottom, rough-cut wood up top, a metal roof that had rusted at the peaks but held, a concrete pad in front. A heavy door with a hasp, and on the hasp, a padlock. She got out in the early cold and stood looking at it. She tried the key. The padlock opened. Inside, it smelled like motor oil and rubber and something else she couldn't immediately name. Metal, maybe. The particular cold metal smell of tools that haven't been touched in a few weeks. She reached along the wall and found a light switch, and a bare bulb came on overhead, and she stood in the doorway and tried to understand what she was looking at. Tools. Everywhere, tools. But not jumbled, not stacked the way a man throws things in a shed. They were organized, hung on pegboard in careful outlines labeled. Bins along one wall with hand-printed index cards, a workbench along the back long and solid, with a lamp on an arm and a stool pulled up to it, and on the workbench, half-finished, was a wheelchair. Not a broken one, a being-built one. The frame was welded steel, the welds so clean they looked machined. The wheels were new, the spokes trued and tight. A footrest on one side was being fitted with foam padding, a half-finished task, the foam cut but not yet shaped. Beside the wheelchair, spread on the workbench in Lyle's handwriting. She would have known it anywhere, the squared-off blocky print he'd used on every grocery list and work order for 26 years. Was a diagram, measurements, notes. On the corner of the diagram, a name. Devin Mosley, age 8, CP, arm reach limited. Needs custom left armrest. Joanna stood at that workbench for a long time. She did not know who Devin Mosley was. She did not know what any of this meant. But she understood, standing in the cold light of a bare bulb in a cinder block building on a half-acre of Clover Fork gravel road, that she had not been married to the man she thought she'd been married to. If you've stayed with us this far into Joanna's story, hit subscribe, because what she found next is the part that changes everything. We've been waiting to tell you this part. She drove back to town and went to the library, because that's where Joanna went when she needed to know something she couldn't find on her own. She'd worked there. 12 years as a reference librarian before the county cut the budget and cut her position with it, and she'd never quite found another place that felt as much like hers. The head librarian now was a woman named Georgette Sims, 63, who had been there longer than Joanna, and knew more about Harlan County than the courthouse did. Georgette looked up when the bell over the door rang, and when she saw Joanna's face, something settled in her expression, the way a person looks when they've been waiting for a conversation they didn't know how to start. "Joe," she said, "I heard about you and Lyle. I'm sorry." "Georgette," Joanna said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me straight." She put the diagram on the counter. "There's a workshop out on Clover Fork. It's Lyle's. There's a wheelchair on the bench in there for a child named Devin Mosley with cerebral palsy. What was my husband doing out there?" Georgette looked at the diagram. She looked at Joanna. Then she came around the counter and took Joanna by the elbow, and sat her down in the chair by the periodicals desk, the same chair Joanna had sat in 100 times during her 12 years. And she pulled up her own chair and said, "There's more than one chair in that shop, you know that?" Joanna hadn't looked carefully enough to count. "I know of at least 11, Georgette said, "over the past 7 years. That I know of." The first one, Georgette told her, had been for a boy named Marcus, the grandson of a woman named Edna Price who attended the same church Lyle occasionally went to at Christmas and Easter. Marcus had been injured in an ATV accident at 12, partial paralysis from the waist down. And his family had no insurance worth speaking of, and a Medicare chair that fit him badly and broke down twice in 6 months. Edna had mentioned it after a service. Lyle had listened. He'd driven out to see Marcus the following Tuesday, taken 17 measurements, asked 20 questions, and then he'd gone and bought a half-backer on Clover Fork and started building. That was 7 years ago, Georgette said. He delivered that chair 6 months later, custom fit. Marcus still uses it. He's in high school now. Joanna sat very still. He never asked for money, Georgette went on. Never took money. I know because Edna tried, and he told her to put it towards something Marcus needed that he couldn't build. Edna told me he turned red to the ears when she tried to hug him. Said, "It fits right, that's all I wanted to know." And he left. He hadn't told anyone, not really. Word spread the way word spreads in a small county, sideways and carefully, to the people who needed to know and away from the people who'd make it into a thing. Georgette had heard because a family came to her, asking if she knew any resources for adaptive equipment, and she'd started asking around, and Lyle's name came up from 3 different directions. "Did he tell you?" Joanna asked. Georgette shook her head. "He didn't know I knew. Far as I can tell, he didn't want anybody knowing too much. Scared it would turn into something public." "Why?" Joanna said, and she heard how her own voice sounded. Not angry, just hollowed. Why would he keep something like that from everybody? Why would he keep it from me? Georgette was quiet for a moment. "Because Lyle Breck has spent his whole life believing that what he does isn't worth talking about," she said finally. "That man fixed a 1/4 mile of secondary road in this county on his own time after a flood one year because KYTC didn't have the budget, and he couldn't stand leaving it the way it was. Did you know that?" Joanna hadn't known that either. "There's a kind of man," Georgette said, "who does things because they need doing and can't conceive of being thanked for them. It's not humility exactly. It's more like he genuinely can't understand why anyone would make a fuss, and so he doesn't tell people, doesn't ask for acknowledgement, just does." "He didn't tell his own wife," Joanna said. "No," Georgette said, "he didn't." She folded her hands on the desk. "And that's a separate thing, Joe. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." Joanna drove back out to the shop on Clover Fork that afternoon. This time she looked more carefully. Against the back wall behind the workbench, on a single shelf that ran the length of the room, there were binders. 7 of them, 3-ring binders, labeled in Lyle's squared-off print. Each one had a name and a year on the spine. She pulled the oldest one first. Inside was a measurement chart, hand-drawn, with a silhouette of a seated figure and lines annotating height, reach, hip width, seat depth, the particular geometry of a body that didn't conform to the standard dimensions of a mass-produced chair. Beside the chart was a photograph, a Polaroid, of a boy in a chair that fit him badly. The footrests too low, the armrests winged out, the way a child holds themselves when the thing that's supposed to help them is just slightly wrong in too many ways to count. On the last page of the binder, another Polaroid, the same boy in a different chair. And this one, you could see it in the photograph in the way the boy was sitting, the way his back was straight, and his arms rested naturally, and his face was turned toward whoever was taking the picture. This chair fit. There was a note in Lyle's handwriting on the back of the photograph. It said, "Right side axle, needed shim. We'll check on him in 3 months." Joanna went through all 7 binders. 11 chairs, 11 names. Children. Mostly. A 10-year-old with spina bifida in Cumberland. A teenage girl recovering from a car accident in Benham. A 7-year-old in Lynch whose standard issue chair had given him pressure sores that landed him in the hospital twice. But also adults. A man of 68 who had a stroke and whose family couldn't afford the adjustable tilt chair the occupational therapist had recommended. And a woman of 40 who'd been in a wheelchair since she was 19 and had simply never had one that didn't cause her daily pain, because she'd never had one built to fit her actual body. Every binder had a before photograph and an after photograph. Every binder had follow-up notes, because Lyle went back, months later, sometimes a year later, to check that the axle was right, or the seat cushion hadn't compressed, or the armrest hadn't worked loose. He drove to Cumberland and Benham and Lynch on Saturdays when he wasn't building, and he never brought it up when he got home, and Joanna had never asked. In the back of the last binder there was a folded piece of paper that had been there long enough to go soft at the creases. She unfolded it under the bare bulb light. It was a letter she had written him. Not recently. The date was 9 years ago, the year before the distance between them had finally stopped feeling like something that would close on its own. She'd written it late one night after a dinner where they'd sat across from each other for 40 minutes without exchanging a word that mattered, and she'd told him, in the letter, because she couldn't say it out loud, that she felt invisible in their marriage, that she needed him to see her, that she was so tired of feeling alone in a room with the person she was supposed to be least alone with in the world. She had left it on his pillow. She had never known if he read it. She knew now. He had kept it for 9 years in the back of a binder, in a shop she didn't know existed. He had read it and kept it, and never found the words to answer it, and instead he had gone out on Saturday mornings and built things for people who needed them, and she did not know if that was an answer, or an evasion, or just the only language he had. Joanna sat down on the concrete floor of that workshop with the letter in her lap and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since the parking lot outside the courthouse where she'd signed the papers. Not grief exactly. Something more complicated. Something that had equal parts sorrow in it and fury, and something she couldn't name, which was the specific ache of understanding a person too late. She had signed the divorce papers 3 weeks ago. She had been so sure she knew him. The family started finding her the way Georgette said they would once since word got around that Lyle's ex-wife had found the shop and wasn't sure what to do with it. They came one at a time, or in twos. A mother and a grandmother, a father and a son. And they stood at the door of the workshop turning their hands over each other and told her things she hadn't known. Edna Price came first. She was 77 and had the kind of stillness about her that comes from a long life of not wasting words. She sat on the tailgate of her truck and told Joanna about Marcus, about the first chair, and the way Lyle had come back 4 months later with a small modification he'd figured out would improve the turning radius. And Marcus hadn't asked for it, and Lyle hadn't called ahead. He'd just driven up on a Tuesday and said, "I've been thinking about something. If you've got 20 minutes. My grandson is going to walk across a stage and get his diploma next spring," Edna said. "He might need help, he might not, but he's going to do it. And a piece of that is Lyle Breck." She looked at the workshop behind Joanna. "That man never once asked for my thanks. But I'm giving them to you because somebody ought to have them." A man named Gareth Tully came, 44, construction foreman, the stroke survivor from the last binder. He had a slight drag to his left foot still, 3 years after the stroke, and he moved carefully on the uneven gravel. He shook Joanna's hand with his right hand, which was steady, and he said, "I went 2 years in a chair that was tipping me to the left. Occupational therapists kept adjusting it. Insurance kept declining the new one. I was falling twice a month. Somebody mentioned Lyle." He paused. He came out, measured me 6 ways, went away and showed up 8 weeks later with a chair. "I haven't fallen since, 18 months. He looked down. "I drove over here because I heard somebody might close this place down, and I want you to know what that would mean." Joanna hadn't said anything about closing it. She hadn't said anything about anything yet, because she didn't know what she thought. Then, the woman from Benham came. Her name was Rosalind, and she was 40, and she'd been in a wheelchair since a car accident at 19. And when she got out of her modified van in Lyle's gravel lot and transferred herself to her chair with the particular economy of motion that 20 years of doing it teaches you, Joanna noticed the chair. The way the backrest was angled exactly so. The way Rosalind's arms rested against the armrests without riding up or dropping down, just level, just right. "I told him about my back," Rosalind said. "First chair I ever had that someone built to my actual back. You know how much difference that makes?" She looked at Joanna steadily. "I used to wake up every morning with my whole lower back in spasm from one night in a chair that didn't fit. I haven't had that since your husband finished this one. I sleep differently. I get through a day differently. People don't understand if the chair doesn't fit, nothing fits. Nothing in your whole day is right." She put her hand on the wheel. "I tried to pay him. He told me to donate the money to a physical therapy scholarship at the community college." She paused. "Did he tell you any of this?" "No," Joanna said. "He didn't." Rosalind looked at her a moment. "That's a complicated thing," she said. "I know it." "It is," Joanna said. My ex-husband had secrets too, Rosalind said. They were not the same kind. She left it there, and Joanna understood what she was being offered. The understanding that there was a difference, and that the difference mattered, even if it didn't solve everything. The one that undid her completely was the last visitor. A woman in her 60s named Suzette Ham, who came on a Thursday with a casserole dish because she apparently didn't know how to show up for someone without bringing food, and Joanna loved her for it immediately. Suzette's husband had died 2 years ago. Degenerative condition, 8 years of slow decline, the last 3 in a wheelchair. Lyle had built 2 chairs over those 8 years, one when the progression changed the way Howard sat, and another in the final year when Howard's needs changed again, and the second chair was no longer right. He drove out every few months, Suzette said. They were sitting in the 2 lawn chairs Joanna had found in the back of the shop and pulled out onto the concrete pad because there was nowhere else to sit. He would come in and talk to Howard for a while, just talk. Not about the chair mostly, about the road crew and the county and whatever game was on. Howard didn't get many visitors in those last years. People don't know what to say. So they stopped coming. Suzette looked at the casserole dish on her knees. Lyle never stopped coming. Every few months, just to see how he was. Joanna looked at her. Howard told me something once, maybe the last year, Suzette said. He said that man never once looks at me like I'm something that needs to be handled. He meant it as the greatest compliment he knew how to give. She paused. I think about that a lot, how rare that is, to sit with someone who's struggling and just be with them. Not solving it, not pitying it, just there. Joanna thought about 26 years of dinners where the silence had felt like absence. She thought about a man who drove out every few months to sit with a dying man and talk about ball games. She thought about a letter on a pillow that he'd kept in a binder for 9 years and never answered, and she was not going to pretend that those 2 things were the same, or that one canceled the other. They didn't. The man who never found the words for her had found his way to a cinder block shop on a gravel road every Saturday for 7 years. Both things were true. She was allowed to be grateful and angry, and bereft. All at once, she was 54 years old. She did not know what to do with what she'd found. She called Brenna that night. Brenna had known Lyle as the man who showed up for meals, and drove her to school when Joanna couldn't, and fixed what needed fixing, and never once told her he was proud of her, or glad she was there, or anything that would have helped. And all of those things were still true. Joanna told her about the shop and the chairs and the binders and Suzette and her husband, and Brenna was quiet for a long time. I don't know if that makes him a good man or a sad one, Brenna finally said. I think it might make him both, Joanna said. Another long silence. What are you going to do with the shop? Joanna looked at the key on the dresser. I don't know yet. She found out the following week that she needed to decide. And quickly, because a man named Kevin Sisko had gotten wind of the property through the county tax records and had driven out to look at it, and had shown up at Vera's door with a business card and a friendly expression and a very specific kind of question about whether Joanna was aware that a gravel quarry operation was looking to expand its staging area in the Clover Fork vicinity, and that a half-acre with a concrete pad and road access was exactly what they were looking for, and had she given any thought to selling. Joanna looked at the business card for a long time. Kevin Sisko, property acquisition, Tarpley Resources. She thought about what $30,000, which was the number he'd eventually mentioned, offhandedly, after explaining how much trouble she'd save herself by letting a professional handle the transaction, would mean for a woman with $340 in her checking account and a cardboard box in her cousin's spare room. She thought about Devin Mosley, age 8, CP, Armreach Limited, needs custom left armrest, whose chair was half finished on the bench. She went back to the workshop the next morning, and she sat on the stool at the bench and she looked at the half-finished chair. The foam was still uncut on one side. She found Lyle's tools where they were labeled. She found the diagram with the measurements. She had no idea how to do what Lyle did. She was a reference librarian by training and a divorced woman by recent circumstance, and she had never built anything more complicated than a bookshelf from a kit. She thought about Rosalind in Benham, waking up without back spasms for the first time. She thought about Marcus getting ready to walk across a stage, or try. She thought about Howard Ham in the last year of his life, with a man sitting beside him who looked at him like he was still a whole person. She called Georgette. I need to find someone who can teach me to weld, she said. Georgette was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, I'll make some calls. Kevin Sisko called back twice more. The second time he mentioned that the quarry company had a timeline, and that the offer wouldn't remain on the table indefinitely, and that he hoped she understood it wasn't personal. She told him she did understand that, and that the property wasn't for sale, and she thanked him for his time, in a voice that came from somewhere she hadn't known she had. He didn't call again. The man Georgette found was named Owen Park, 66, retired from the railroad, who had been welding since he was 19 and had, it turned out, known about Lyle's shop for 3 years, and had driven out twice to look at Lyle's welds and been impressed enough that he'd done a double take on the quality. He came out on a Saturday morning, looked at the half-finished frame on the bench, looked at the diagram, looked at Joanna. "You know anything about metalwork?" he said. "No," she said. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We start at the start." It took her 4 months to finish Devin Mosley's chair. Owen came 2 Saturdays a month and worked beside her and answered questions and corrected mistakes without making her feel the correction, which she understood later, was a particular skill and not an accident. She ruined 2 pieces of frame stock learning to run a bead. She got the seat geometry wrong the first time and had to recalculate. She drove to Cumberland to meet Devin and his parents, and took measurements herself and sat in their living room and listened to his mother describe what a day looked like, where the difficulties were, what mattered. She delivered the chair in November. Devin was 8 years old and had eyes that took in everything, and a voice that came out sideways of where you expected it, because his CP affected his speech. When she set the chair in front of him and he moved from his old one into it, his mother put both hands over her mouth. His father turned away. Devin sat in the chair and reached for something on the table beside him, a small toy, and his left arm. The arm reach limited arm, the one she'd spent 2 weeks getting the custom rest right for, reached without hitching. Just reached. The way you reach for something when nothing is in the way. He looked up at Joanna and he said, in his sideways voice, "It's good." She sat in her car in the parking lot of their apartment complex for 20 minutes afterward. Not crying exactly. Something quieter than that. Something she had no word for, which was the feeling of understanding. Finally, what Lyle had been driving toward every Saturday for 7 years. She drove home on the same road she'd taken the first time, past the feed mill and the cattle gate, and she understood that the shop was hers now in a way that had nothing to do with the property deed. She had earned the key. She told Owen she wanted to keep going. He said he'd figured as much. They kept going. She called Brenna on a Sunday evening that winter and told her about Devin and the chair and Owen and the welding and all of it. And Brenna was quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was working something out. "Do you understand him better now?" Brenna asked. "Lyle?" Joanna thought about it honestly. "I understand what he could do," she said. "I understand what he built. I still don't fully understand why he couldn't bring it home, why he couldn't let me in." She paused. "I think maybe he didn't believe what he was doing was worth talking about. And I think separately, I think he was afraid of being known that completely by someone who might leave anyway." Brenna was quiet again then. "He let you leave?" "Yes," Joanna said. "He did. Is that forgiveness? What you're doing out there?" Joanna looked out the window at the dark ridgeline above Harlan. "I don't know what it is," she said. "It's not forgiveness, exactly. It's more like I found a room I didn't know was in the house. I can't unfind it, and somebody left a light on in it." She paused. "I want to keep the light on." She found the letter again in February when she went through the last binder a second time, more carefully. She had looked at it once before and put it back, because she hadn't been ready. Now she unfolded it again under the workbench lamp and read it in her own handwriting from 9 years ago. Every word she'd put down at a kitchen table at midnight about being invisible and being tired and needing to be seen. And then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She turned the letter over. She picked up the pen she kept at the bench for measurements and notes. She wrote on the back, "I found it, Lyle. I found what you were trying to say. You could have told me. You should have told me. I would have understood. I don't know if you knew that." She put it back in the binder. She kept going. By the following spring, there were 3 people besides Joanna working out of the shop on Saturdays. Owen, still, and a physical therapist named Dara, who'd heard about what Joanna was doing and driven out from Middlesboro to see it, and a retired machinist named Floyd, who showed up one day with a truck full of donated aluminum stock and said he didn't need anything except to be useful. Joanna didn't turn him away. They had finished 4 chairs. The 5th was on the bench. Devin Mosley had come back with his mother in the fall for a 6-month check, and Joanna had adjusted the left armrest, slightly where the foam had compressed, and she'd noticed something she hadn't expected. Devin had grown. She'd had to raise the seat height 3/4 of an inch. She'd noted it in the binder. She would check again in 6 months. She had started a second binder. Her own handwriting, not Lyle's. One morning in April, a year and a half after she'd first stood at a padlocked door, with a key she didn't know she was carrying, Joanna Tillett arrived at the shop at 7 in the morning before anyone else, and stood in the open doorway drinking coffee and looking at what was inside. The binders on the shelf, 7 of Lyle's and 1 of hers. The tools hung in their outlines on the pegboard. Owen's safety glasses on their hook by the door. The bench with its diagram and its lamp, and the half-built frame waiting for Saturday. She thought about a key on a piece of twine. She thought about a letter she'd written at midnight and left on a pillow, and a man who'd kept it for 9 years in the back of a binder and never found the words to answer it. She thought about how many things she'd been sure of on the day she sat in that parking lot with $340 in a cardboard box. The marriage had been real in its failures. He had been genuinely absent in the ways she'd needed him to be present. She was not going to revise that, was not going to stand in a workshop and tell herself the story over into something cleaner. She had needed more than he gave her, and she had been right to say so, and the divorce had been the right thing. And also, separately, without canceling any of that, he had built 11 chairs for people who needed them, and driven back to check on every one of them and never told a soul. Both things were in the same room. She was done trying to choose which one was the real story. She finished her coffee and went in and turned on the bench lamp and pulled up the stool. She had a chair to build. The people who drove past the gravel turn on Clover Fork Road mostly didn't notice the small workshop at the end of the ruts, and the few who did didn't know what went on inside it. Joanna had put up no sign. She had not called the paper, had not made it into anything Lyle would have hated, had not let it become a thing that required anyone's attention or admiration to keep going. She had simply kept the door open, the way the key had always been asking her to. At 54, she had been so sure she was leaving one story behind, and that what came next would be smaller, quieter, a diminished thing. What she had found instead, in a cinder block building at the end of a gravel road on a half-acre of Clover Fork ground, was the thing she'd been asking for at midnight for years. Not a different husband, not a different marriage. Just the plain and difficult truth of what can be built when a person stops going along and starts at the start, with no promise that it will work out. Only the knowledge that Devin Mosley's left arm reached for something this morning without anything in the way. That was the light. She was keeping it on.